Epilogue. Dusk. The preceding first-person oral account of Ajaan Jia's life ends with the 1984 trip to Changrong Cave. Most of the description that follows, chronicling the final 20 years of his life, was provided by the editors of the original Thai edition of Gold Wrapped in Rags. These compilers either told their version of the events that happened during those years or quoted accounts gleaned from the comments made by Ajaan Jia's contemporaries. In the following epilogue, I have combined the sequence of events that the editors described in detail and elaborated on those stories with descriptions collected from other sources to bring the chronicle of Ajaan Jia's life and practice to an inspirational conclusion. Ajaan Jia returned from Changrong Cave having made a decision about his future role in the Forest Sangha, but without a plan for how to realize it. However, his old friend, Ajaan Maha Boowa, was already one step ahead of him. A longtime lay disciple of his had recently purchased a tract of land in Pathum Thani province and offered the property to him in the hope that he would build a forest monastery at the site. By the time the two Ajaans met again in 1984, Ajaan Maha Boowa had already determined that Ajaan Jia was the only monk he trusted to head up the project and make it a success. Not only did he feel it was time for Ajaan Jia to have a monastery of his own, but he also believed that his character had the rigor and resolve needed to transform a piece of land on Thailand's central lowlands into a forest monastery in the style of Ajaan Mun. To honor their venerated teacher, Ajaan Jia decided to name the new monastery Buridhatta Patipat Arama Forest Monastery, Buridhatta being Ajaan Mun's formal monastic ordination name. Both Ajaan Maha Boowa and Ajaan Jia had put their lives on the line in the service of Ajaan Mun and his teachings. They shared in that inspiring experience and understood its transformative qualities. Among that generation of Ajaan Mun's disciples, Ajaan Maha Boowa had been one of the most successful at replicating the intensity and strictness of wilderness training inside the confines of an established monastic center. Ajaan Jia agreed to put down roots in Pathum Thani under the condition that Ajaan Maha Boowa lend his strength and advice to get the project off the ground. In 1984, Ajaan Jia moved his old and aching body to Pathum Thani, where he planned to drag a new generation of forest monks, kicking and screaming, back to the old ways of Dhutanga training. But first, he had to build the basic infrastructure for a functioning monastic community. The land that he had been offered measured about 50 acres in total. Much of the property was covered with pine forest that had an abundance of thick foliage and limited undergrowth. A smaller section of the property was open pasture. Another section consisted of fallow rice fields where the mud walls that retained the rainwater needed to grow rice followed the contours of the land in large rectangular patterns. Those low earthen walls also served as raised walkways between the fields. The open land was bordered on two sides by a shallow canal. The environment certainly had potential, but much work would be needed to shape many different environments into a viable monastic living space. With the help of local devotees, Ajaan Jia set to work. First building a simple abbot's residence, a small bamboo hut placed at the edge of the pine forest. He constructed the hut using 4 wooden posts to support a raised floor and a thatched roof made of woven coconut fronds. The walls consisted of old and frayed monks' robes hung like curtains to shield the 4 sides. From this cool, breezy platform, Ajaan Jia surveyed the farmland in front of him and contemplated how to incorporate the open spaces into the overall monastic ground plan, so that the pine forest behind him would not feel like an island of forest encircled by a sea of tamed fields. Fortunately, a group of dedicated engineers volunteered to offer their services. Together with Ajaan Jia, they drew up plans to fill the sunken portions of the rice fields between the mud walls with compacted earth, thus leveling the land area so that any water that did not sink into the soil would run off into the canals instead of collecting in the fields. It also opened the possibility of reforesting the undeveloped pasture and field areas. Since tree saplings often take decades to grow to a mature height, the earth-moving work became their first priority. The rice fields were positioned in a wide area that spread out on both sides of the entrance road. Ajaan Jia's crew brought in excavating equipment to dig out earth from the adjacent pasture. The fresh soil was used to fill each rectangular section of the rice field to the top of the low wall. When one section had been fully compacted, a dump truck drove over it to begin depositing soil into the next section. By the time the job had been completed, the ground level of the entire area had been raised above the water level in the canals, which helped to prevent future flooding. The large holes left in the ground after the earth was removed became rainwater ponds. When work on the infrastructure began in earnest, a group of Ajaan Jia's energetic monastic disciples joined the effort, prompting the team to build more bamboo huts in the shelter of the pine forest. They also erected a small pavilion where the monks would gather in the morning for the meal and in the evening for instruction and meditation. Despite the unusual workload, Ajaan Jia made a point of maintaining the basic framework of a monastic routine as much as possible. At first, the group had no building materials and very few tools. When Ajaan Jia found old, rusting, corrugated tin roofing or used lumber that had been thrown away to rot, he conjured up ways to reuse these items. Because he abhorred wastefulness, Ajaan Jia mended broken tools himself and put them back into service. Rocks that had been sledgehammered to the consistency of gravel were used to pave the entrance road. Under a shaded lean-to built in the open pasture in front of Ajaan Jia's hut, bricks and mortar were utilized to construct a blacksmith's forge where he started making his own tools. Firing the forge with dead wood from the forest floor, he would heat up pieces of scrap metal until they were red-hot and hammer them into axes, hatchets, machetes, and hoes, which he would fit with sturdy hardwood handles. As the years passed, more and larger permanent structures were constructed to complete the institutional requirements of an official monastic compound. The dedicated monks who had helped Ajaan Jia build the monastery eventually moved away, seeking more secluded locations to further advance their meditation practice. They were replaced by younger, less experienced monks, lacking the same wisdom and judgment. Monks who needed to be thoroughly schooled in the basic principles of the Dhutanga lifestyle: austerity, strict discipline, and strong concentration. The longer a monk stays in the same place, the more he puts down roots. Because the monastic community relies on donations, a monk can easily become beholden to the lay devotees who make daily offerings of food and refreshments. Wealthy devotees often make large donations to the building fund, giving them a vested interest in the success of the monastery. They usually want the buildings to be grand, impressive, and pleasing to the eye. When the donors visit the monastery, they notice features that displease them, so they lobby the abbot to build structures that are more attractively designed to replace the old and still functional but less attractive ones. Beautiful monastic buildings require daily cleaning and maintenance, tasks which consume hours of a monk's daily routine that could be more suitably spent in meditation. Ultimately, it is the abbot's responsibility to oversee construction and maintenance issues while also supervising the monks in their daily schedule from the wake-up call at 3 a.m. until late into the night. That extra workload can be exhausting for an elderly monk. Because Ajaan Jia's monastery was located within driving distance of Bangkok and its sprawling suburbs, food offerings were delivered directly to the monastery to supplement the food that the monks collected on alms round. As time passed and the monastery's reputation spread, more donors showed up each day bringing larger quantities of good-quality food. Fine rice and delicious curries soon became the norm. Consequently, the monks had to cope with a sumptuous meal and a full stomach each morning, a recipe for a mind full of sloth and torpor. Ajaan Jia did not begrudge the monks the fine food, but its wide variety was a far cry from the food of his days living with Ajaan Mun. He had remained with Ajaan Mun for 3 rainy seasons and 4 dry seasons, subsisting for the most part on just rice and bananas. Unfortunately, he was allergic to most of the food that villagers offered in the north and the northeast. When no bananas were offered, he resorted to eating just plain rice, a diet that tended to cause indigestion and painful constipation. Because stomach medicines were unavailable in the wilderness, he was sometimes forced to stick 2 fingers down his own throat to induce vomiting, just to clear out his churning stomach. He said that his index and middle fingers were the medicine he never failed to carry with him in those days. Ajaan Jia sometimes felt he was raising young, domesticated Dhutanga monks who, after enjoying a sumptuous meal, wandered from the main pavilion back to their huts to take a nap. Laziness had crept into their minds with its mallet raised, ready to sound the death knell for the Buddha's austere ascetic practices. Fit and healthy bodies strolled around the monastery grounds with weak and flabby minds in charge. Even the birds and squirrels looked plump and overfed. In the past, the great teachers in Ajaan Jia's tradition, from Ajaan Sao and Ajaan Mun on down, played the role of forest tigers to spur their disciples' innate virtues into action, inspiring in them the motivation and the courage to confront the jungle of unruly thoughts and emotions in their minds. One roar from the tiger's mouth sent chills up the spine and demanded unerring vigilance. How many of those fierce tigers were left? Not many. Most of those who remained had lost the spring in their step and the loud, deep growl in their throat. But they still had the roar in their hearts, if only their disciples could become aware of it. Instead, that later generation of Dhutanga monks seemed to have forsaken a life of greater hardship to follow the path of least resistance, an attitude completely at odds with those great monks of the past. At that point in his life, Ajaan Jia's teaching had lost its hard edge. But then again, blunt force did not seem to have the same effect that it had with previous generations. Nonetheless, he had to acknowledge that some of his students might be capable of achieving significant breakthroughs in their meditation if he played the role of the tiger and made them endure austerities severe enough to open their eyes to the advantages of wilderness practice. If he left them to their own devices, simply allowing them to continue on as they had, it was clear that their eyes would remain closed for the rest of their lives. If they were to die without seeing the light, they would certainly have squandered a golden opportunity to break free of birth and death and experience the bliss of supreme happiness. For that reason, Ajaan Jia was vociferous in urging his students to take the meditation skills they had developed while practicing with him and trek into the country's remaining wilderness areas, where they could hone those skills to perfection and test their ability to cope with difficulties until they found a way through the unruly jungle of their worldly attitudes and opinions. After working for many years to create Buddhadatta Forest Monastery in the spirit of Ajaan Mun and the Dhutanga forest tradition that he championed, Ajaan Jia felt the need to refresh himself with a period of solitude and silence. Aware of this intention, a group of senior disciples volunteered to accompany their aging teacher on a return tour of the wilderness caves in Tak province. After visiting various caves in the region, the group finished its tour deep in the jungle at a cave known as Intanin. The trail leading up to Intanin Cave was so narrow that they almost expected it to peter out among the rocks before it reached the entrance. Several times the trail crossed swiftly running streams on makeshift bridges made of rotting tree trunks. Both sides of the trail were dense with tangled vegetation and alive with the cries and chirping of birds and insects. As the trail became steeper, it sometimes assumed the shape of stairs worn into the rock. The cave's entrance came into view unexpectedly, as it was hidden from afar behind a veil of broadleaf jungle foliage. Intanin Cave was situated on a south-facing mountain slope, overlooking an unbroken view of valleys and mountains, some of which had summits that masked even loftier peaks beyond. A broad, arched opening, recessed into the rock face, allowed sunlight to reach the cave's back wall, creating a spacious, domed chamber some 60 feet deep, 100 feet wide, and 30 feet high. Because air entered the chamber and circulated freely, The atmosphere inside the cave was cool and dry at that time of year, in sharp contrast to the constant heat and humidity experienced at Buddhadata Forest Monastery. Sheltering in caves had always given Ajaan Jia temporary respite from the dangers of camping out in the open. Wild animals, snakes, mosquitoes, and other insects mostly avoided the interior spaces of caves. Additionally, the stable temperatures of caves provided a cool habitat in the summer and a warm, dry shelter in the winter, making for an exceptional meditation environment. The silence Ajaan Jia experienced living in caves was so absolute that not only could he hear his own heart beating, but at times he felt he could sense the blood coursing through his arteries and veins. The entire atmosphere seemed to pulse with energy. Ajaan Jia told his disciples that the environment in and around Intanin Cave was so agreeable and therapeutic to his physical ailments that had he come across it before committing himself to Buddhadata Forest Monastery, he might well have chosen to spend the remainder of his life there instead. Mind you, cave life is very Spartan. Seated in the seclusion of a cave, a solitary recluse has no company save that afforded by the trickling of water on the nearby rocks and the stirring of wild creatures in the woods. Hunger awaits him in the morning as he makes his way down the narrow trail in the half-light of dawn, at times in the pouring rain, to reach the nearest village settlement often located a long walk away. The meager food offerings placed in his bowl might consist only of lumps of plain rice with chili paste and some edible wild plants. Before long, he becomes as thin and haggard as a walking skeleton, with pallid skin drawn taut over his bony cheeks. His threadbare robes are patched by hand with scavenged pieces of cloth. Why would a monk take up forest dwelling as a way of life unless he was totally dedicated to the practice, begrudging neither his health nor his life? Such a monk does not simply grit his teeth and endure hardship and deprivation as some form of penance. Instead, he embraces the opportunity to test his resolve by confronting difficulties and using the powers of his mind to firmly resist any tendency to give up and accept defeat. The more demanding the challenge, the more spirited his response. That fighting spirit keeps a Dhutanga monk steadfast on the path to liberation. Since many kinds of living beings exist at various levels of understanding, the path to liberation takes different forms, some long and plodding, others short but arduous. The shortest and most direct path requires deliberately confronting difficult circumstances that provoke conflict and resistance in the mind of the meditator, and using the challenge of overcoming them as motivation to intensify the practice. Living and practicing in wild places has unrivaled advantages as a way of life focused on throwing off the yoke of ignorance and attaining enlightenment as fast as possible. Such living requires a mindset that seeks the path of greatest resistance to counter the mind's usual inclination to settle for a path of least resistance to the strong pull of greed, aversion, and delusion. The wilderness is the perfect arena in which to experience a collision between the forces of oppressive defilements and the liberating power of Dhamma, which is the very purpose for which the Dhutanga practices were initially created. Rather than avoiding defilements, seeking relief from them, or compensating for them, liberation from suffering entails confronting the causes that give rise to suffering head-on and boldly eliminating them. Deliberately choosing the hardships of living alone in the wilderness is a practice that compels meditators to develop the inner strength needed to overcome their fear of ever-present dangers while rejecting the sensual appeal of physical ease and comfort. Ease and comfort are the enemies of genuine spiritual practice. When the mind is backed into a corner from which no escape is apparent, it is forced to take refuge in resources of courage and inner strength that were not known to have existed until the frightening circumstances arose to call them forth. Courage here does not refer to a lack of fear, but rather to using the heightened sense of alertness and the energizing qualities that fear evokes as a means of quickly centering the mind in present-moment awareness, where it can realize its highest potential. To live in the wildness of nature is to gain unique insights into the significance of the Buddha's teachings. residing alone in wilderness environments had taught Ajaan Jia many profound lessons. Lessons in life's fleeting, transitory nature. Lessons in the pervasiveness of suffering in all forms of life. And lessons in how little control human beings have over the cycle of living and dying. When observed closely with a clear mind, nature reveals a core principle that governs all forms of life. Everything comes and goes. For instance, the forest contains dead and dying trees in different stages of decay, some slowly dying with dry brown leaves still clinging to life, some already dead with thin sheets of bark hanging from the trunk, some pale, smooth, dead trees with hardly any limbs left, and some long dead ones, rotten while yet standing, with the soft outer layer of sapwood eaten away by insects. Newly fallen dead trees lie side by side with rotten trunks that fell long ago. By the time their crumbling carcasses have disintegrated into the ground beneath them, faint traces of organic matter are all that remain on the ground's surface. From these moldering remains sprout fungi and new plant growth, carrying on the universal cycle of death, decay, and regeneration. Observing the life and death cycle of a forest tree serves as a reminder that the disintegration of a human corpse follows a similar process. When a corpse is left on the ground and exposed to the elements, it slowly rots in the warm sunshine. As time passes and decay accelerates, the skin darkens and the corpse begins to bloat. Eventually the skin ruptures and peels away, revealing the decaying flesh beneath. By the time maggots have eaten their fill of rotting tissue and vultures have scavenged the rest, most of the flesh and internal organs are gone. With the passage of time and exposure to the elements, the remaining scraps of tissue wash away, leaving only disjointed bones bleached white by the sun. In due course, the bones begin to break up and disintegrate. These too will eventually wear away and turn to dust, finally reclaimed by the earth element from which they came. Although Ajaan Jia preferred to shelter in the relative security of forest caves, the untamed wilderness environment outside the cave reminded him of just how harrowingly painful the lives of the wild animals could be. Living alone in the wilderness, he witnessed the drama of animal existence unfold up close. The peril and uncertainty of animal life in the jungle never seemed to end. Every day was a fight for survival, for everything from the largest tiger to the smallest rodent, either to find enough food to live on each day or to avoid the agony of being killed and eaten. Driven by hunger, many wild animals foraged and scavenged constantly. Continually on the lookout for threats to themselves and their young, forest animals could never fully let down their guard. Between struggling to stay alive and fighting to protect themselves and their offspring, animals in their natural habitat embodied real-life instances of suffering and its consequences. Whether roaming widely or living a whole lifetime confined to a single tree, their existence was trapped in a vicious cycle of persistent craving and chronic deficiency. The lifespans of wild animals were generally short, their deaths often painful. Across the wilderness landscape, the ruthless scenes of a predator attacking and killing its prey were commonplace. Witnessing these deadly attacks firsthand, Ajaan Jia could perceive the intensity of the fear experienced by vulnerable prey as predators stalked and ultimately slaughtered them. In one instance, he saw a tiger catch a deer and sink its sharp claws into the deer's rump, ripping through the hide and anchoring its grip deep in the muscle. The startled animal let out a disturbing, agonizing cry as its body hit the ground. An instant later, the tiger sank its teeth into the deer's throat, choking off the sound of terror. Its vice-like jaws closed tightly to break the neck, leaving the deer to die a slow and excruciating death. Its young likely died soon after from starvation. He had seen hawks swoop down from the treetops, talons extended, to catch and kill squirrels running across the branches below, and then use their hooked beaks to tear bite-sized pieces of flesh from the still-living animal to temporarily abate their hunger pangs. Leopards were fond of stalking and catching unsuspecting monkeys, which they ripped apart and ate on the spot. Bears had tremendous strength and a dispassionate approach to killing any animal that crossed their path. They often began to feed immediately, without waiting for the prey to die. Starvation was a common cause of death for animals who were injured or aging. Eventually, their bodies simply wore out, and they were no longer able to forage or stalk their prey. As death approached, their backbones stuck out grotesquely, and their intestines and stomachs were sunken through to the bone before they finally collapsed to the ground. The Dhutanga monks with whom wild animals share their forest abode feel a deep kinship with all creatures in the natural world, which arouses in them a feeling that we are all one and the same. One in the sense that all living beings without exception are subjected to suffering in the course of being born, growing old, falling sick, and dying. Darkness and light, illness and health, and life and death are simply part of the back and forth of the impermanence of nature. The highs and lows of life center around personal feelings, but the natural world is completely apathetic to the feelings of living beings. It is not involved in nor influenced by personal sentiments. Dispassionate and impartial, it remains wholly indifferent to their happiness or suffering. Ajaan Jia found that living alone in the wilderness for an extended period was one of the best ways to learn Dhamma lessons from the natural world, because what he witnessed there put the Buddha's teachings into clearer perspective. It made him realize how vast the world of sentient experience was, and how profoundly insignificant the person called Jia was by contrast. The wilderness never gave a damn about him. The birth of his body added nothing to it. Its death would take nothing away from it. Body and mind were just a part of the same impersonal process of birth, decay, and death. There was no me or mine involved in that experience. Ajaan Jia's personal preferences had no control over the outcome of that process. In his contemplations of the natural world, he found only the absence of an intrinsic essence, and thus found nothing worthy of clinging or attachment. He felt he was merely a part of a moment in time in the wild, and he felt no need to identify with it. Trees, the sage observers of the natural world, like sentient living creatures, have life stages that include birth, growth, injury, disease, old age, and death. As trees go from birth to death, their physical forms change, as do their roles in the different communities of forest plants and wild animals. The oldest trees are living monuments of long-term survival that help keep forests alive by passing on their experience and hardiness to the other trees and plants in their environment. Woodland areas can be viewed as large communities of trees, each containing many different families that include infants, adolescents, mature adults, and venerated elders. Tree families in a forest community need their elders, as they are the source of the forest's resilience and renewal when it is faced with the ravages of wind and weather. Their cool shade encourages the growth and development of younger members. Their dead leaves enrich the forest floor, making it a fertile habitat for the birth and growth of future generations. Without this clearly noticeable effect of ancient trees, a community of trees cannot fully realize its natural potential. Like ancient trees in the forest of human history, towering figures like Ajaan Sao and Ajaan Mun, who lived and practiced the ageless ways of wisdom, had remarkable knowledge and skills to pass on to their disciples. Few trees in the spiritual forest stood taller or offered more shade than these great masters. Their Bodhi leaves of wisdom, which fertilized the ground of practice for future generations of practitioners, became indispensable for the long-term survival of the forest meditation tradition. The essence of that tradition, the single motivation that inspired it from the beginning and continues to influence the lives of those who practice it today, is the solemn resolve to attain the end of all suffering by the most direct and effective means possible. The monks that represent the tradition thrive in environments of adversity, hardship, and struggle. Able to withstand and recover quickly from difficult conditions, these monks open a path to spiritual transcendence for future generations.